Good morning, I'm Janice Peterson and welcome to an SBS World News special event. The historic meeting between the President of the United States of America and the Supreme Leader of North Korea, Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un. Never before has a sitting US president met a North Korean dictator, but that is due to change in about 15 minutes' time. I'm joined in the studio by SBS's international editor, Brian Thompson. Thanks so much for joining us. And also former Australian ambassador to South Korea, Richard Brunowski. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. We have a lot to talk about, but first, in Singapore, we have SBS's chief political correspondent, Brett Mason, while reporter Hannah Sinclair is in Seoul. So let's go straight to Singapore. These are live pictures coming in now from Sentosa Island, where the meeting is due to take place in just a matter of minutes. Not much happening now, but that is due to change, of course. Brett, you're in Singapore. Tell us, is there any late word on what we can expect today?
Well, Janice, as you say, both leaders are now on Sentosa Island. Donald Trump's motorcade left the Shangri-La Hotel around half an hour ago. He arrived first on the island. Once he had arrived at the very exclusive Capella Hotel, where these talks are scheduled to take place in around 10 to 15 minutes' time, Kim Jong-un's motorcade departed from his hotel. Very quick trip across the city to that island. Just last night, the North Korean dictator surprised everyone here by embarking on a skylight tour of Singapore. He was captured walking through the streets, even cheered remarkably by onlookers, which is extraordinary given this is a dictator who has murdered and imprisoned his political opponents, even members of his own family. So for him, many experts here saying that Kim Jong-un has arrived as a global superpower. President Trump, he wasn't out and about on the town last night, but he was tweeting very early this morning, around 5:30 a.m. in fact. The president tweeting, "The fact that I am having a meeting is a major loss for the US, say the haters and the losers. We have our hostages, testing, research and all missile launches have stopped, and these pundits who have called me wrong from the beginning have nothing else they can say. We will be fine." Remarkably, in a huge break from diplomatic tradition, once that handshake takes place, we've seen a quick glimpse of what that will look like. They will stand on red carpet in front of the US and North Korean flags. We understand that Donald Trump won't smile during that photograph. We've seen quite animated photographs of the president during previous meetings. We understand he will be rather demure for this photo opportunity. They will then disappear inside and they will meet one-on-one. The only other people in the room will be their respective translators. That meeting will go for around 45 minutes. They will then be joined for a longer diplomatic discussion, which will involve diplomats and the US Secretary of State. Then there will be a larger still working lunch before we hear from those leaders later this afternoon. So that's where we're headed, but this really is uncharted territory. Janice?
Thanks so much for that update there live from Singapore. Gentlemen, we might discuss some of this in a bit more detail now. Richard, how important do you think this meeting is for the people on the Korean Peninsula?
It's existential. It's extremely important. If this doesn't work, if there's no beginning of some kind of process of negotiation, and both sides have what they want to put on the table, and that has to be shown, then we enter a dark period. We enter a period where the agreement arranged by President Moon Jae-in and North Korea in 27th of April will come to nothing. We come back to a period of hostility and suspicion, and possibly, just possibly, someone might go wrong and there could be some kind of cataclysm. They're the stakes we're playing here, in my view.
And for you, Brian, what's your take on this? Obviously, it is hard to predict two very unpredictable world leaders. But what are your expectations? Is this going to simply be a meet and greet, which in itself is very significant, or can we see a legacy-making deal?
Donald Trump's involved, so expect the unexpected. But at the outset of this process, he wanted a quick fix. He wanted North Korea to get rid of its nuclear weapons in one go. He's been very careful ever since then, particularly since John Bolton's comments about a Libyan solution to this. He's been very careful to say it won't be a Libyan solution. You'll still be in power, and this will be a long and drawn-out process. But this is all, again, today about a photo opportunity. Donald Trump loves being in front of the cameras, and he's got the world's attention, and he is going to make the most of it.
Well, Donald Trump says he'll know within the first minute of meeting Kim Jong-un whether he will give up his nuclear weapons. What do you think of that approach?
I think that's hyperbole. I think probably he can sit down and talk with the man, and if they smile at each other and are friendly, yes, he'll say, let's go ahead, see where we go. But whether he's going to have anything substantial at this stage to say in that first discussion, it really remains to be seen. It seems to me that what he's doing is trying to set the scene. He's going to say, look, you know, I can deal with this man. Let's see whether we can do business. We've got our second tier, our second echelon of people beavering away 24 hours a day. It's important that we establish confidence that we mean business, that we're fair dinkum about doing something. If he doesn't feel that, of course, the man's going to walk away.
I suppose we wouldn't have got this far, though, Richard, they know that they're going to be able to come to some sort of agreement today. They've had teams there in advance. The negotiations have been taking place. So Donald Trump's not the sort of person that would like to go to Singapore and be humiliated. I presume he thinks that they can get something substantial signed.
I think you're right, but the man is unpredictable. Brian, we just aren't quite sure where he's going to go. But I agree with you. I think you don't set up all this mechanism, all this excitement, all this complete frenetic activity, especially on the part of the third estate, if you don't mean business and if this is not going to lead somewhere. I agree.
Let's head back now to Singapore. All the talk, of course, has been around denuclearisation, but what about human rights? Can the US, or indeed the rest of the world, seriously consider any loosening of sanctions unless Pyongyang changes its position on human rights? So let's dip in now to Brett Mason in Singapore. Brett, are we likely to see much talk on human rights in Singapore?
Well, Janice, frankly, we aren't. The US delegation here has said that human rights will not be up for discussion during today's first meeting. They're talking about this more as a relationship-building exercise. And yes, on face value, this is a photo opportunity. But the US delegation here supporting Donald Trump say that we can't underestimate the significance of that. And you can see now diplomats arriving here, and we think that we may be very close to seeing that historic handshake. Janice?
We can see pictures now of Kim Jong-un arriving at the summit. A few people in a delegation meeting him here, but it looks like Kim Jong-un is the first one to make it to this lavish hotel for this historic meeting. Gentlemen, do we read much into that? Who got there first?
I don't think so. I think this is all symbolism. Are we going to be able to get inside and see the actual handshake or not?
We will, yes, we will see the handshake.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
May I say, sorry, on human rights, that's an ambit claim. Human rights, kidnapped Japanese, all these things are really should be off the table at this stage, in my view. They've got to concentrate, and I think this is what they want to do, on the nuclear deal and where it's going and what the Americans are prepared to trade off in terms of a peace treaty or, a promise not to attack North Korea. These are the things that are important at this stage.
And I suppose we've got to work out what denuclearisation actually means.
Of course.
Because it seems to mean different things to the two different sides. And Kim, if he is to give up his nuclear weapons, and I don't think any of us really think that that's ultimately the short-term plan, but even if he did, this is much more about symbolism, I think.
I agree. It's a very complex process. I mean, you've got missiles, you've got explosives, you've got hydrogen bombs hidden away. it's going to be, he's apparently blown up his tunnels where he's been testing weapons, but who knows that he probably has other tunnels as well.
They have a history of this.
It's a shell game that has to be played out.
Let's head now to our reporter Hannah Sinclair. She's live for us in Seoul. Hannah, tell us what's the feeling on the ground there. How are people feeling?
Well, this really is history in the making, Janice, and people here are gathered around TV screens in Seoul Station. We just heard a bit of a noise there with the pictures. People are closely watching what's going to happen today. We've spoken to people here, and this is a country that's been divided for so long. People are optimistic about what might be achieved, but overall, people are pretty cautious as well. They've really borne the brunt of the unpredictability of the North, and so they think that this could be a good first step. They're open to having dialogue with the North, and what they'd really like to see is maybe a blueprint for potential peace on the peninsula. They know that everything can't be achieved in one meeting, in one summit, but this is a very welcome step here. There's been a big shift in mood here. You've got to remember just, less than 7 months ago, nuclear missiles were being fired on the peninsula here. It was a very different mood in a city like Seoul, but that's shifted with a lot of the the Winter Olympics and a lot of the gestures and the really momentum that President Moon has tried to drive. And so people here, they're really watching this extremely closely. People say that they do have a bit of concern about the motivation of Kim Jong-un, that he's more trying to impress the US and more concerned about doing a deal with them than necessarily looking out for South Koreans. So we've spoken to a lot of people here over the past few days. We've spoken to displaced Koreans. They would like to see something that would allow them to travel more freely to the North. Other people, we've noticed a bit of a generational divide. Younger people in Seoul say this is a good thing. Having dialogue with Kim Jong-un, they welcome President Trump's moves. They're a little bit worried about potential effects on the economy, but they're a little bit more open to it than perhaps their parents and older generations who don't necessarily like the moves of the government here. There's a lot of domestic politics, and that is factoring into how people are feeling here. But this is certainly being watched very closely. People are awaiting the next few hours and what exactly is going to happen.
And that domestic politics, well, that's feeding into all of these leaders, Donald Trump, Kim Jong-un, and as you say, it's playing out there in South Korea too. Let's head back to Singapore now and Brett Mason. Brett, what are you expecting to see out of this meeting today?
Well, just to touch on what Hannah and Brian were saying earlier, any outcome here will be, we know, incremental. There will not be one definitive deal achieved here in Singapore. And we also suspect that the outcome today will be largely symbolic. But a first step generally is symbolic, and we expect that any program of denuclearization will take some time. Remember, we have been down this path before with Kim Jong-un's father and grandfather. The very, very interesting thing about this summit is that Kim Jong-un has achieved what neither of those two men could, a face-to-face meeting with a serving US president. That is extraordinary, and many believe this has been his goal all along. Money that could have been spent feeding starving North Koreans, clothing them, providing them with public services, has been spent almost exclusively on amassing this arsenal of nuclear weapons. Those weapons have bought him a seat on the world stage, and he is absolutely going to milk every second of this summit, both domestically and internationally. As analysts here have been saying, Kim Jong-un has arrived on the world stage, and we now think that Donald Trump, the US president, is arriving at those talks on Sentosa Island. Janice, talk us through what you're seeing there with Donald Trump arriving at these talks.
We're certainly seeing a cavalcade here of very big black vehicles driving in, so we suspect that Donald Trump is in one of them. One of them's just pulling up right now. It is less than a minute, I believe, until the official start of the meeting, so we're definitely expecting to see Mr. Trump getting out of this vehicle at any second. So let's see who's behind the door.
There he is.
Let's listen and see if he says anything. No.
Button up your coat.
Very somber, very somber.
Yeah, and there's no
Very
shaking of
portentous.
hands.
Yes.
There's no photo opportunity outside the hotel. Looks like we're not going to get much of a glimpse of what's happening behind those doors, gentlemen.
No, it doesn't seem so. We
have been promised a picture, and remember there are photographers outside and inside, so let's just keep an eye on this. It is the picture that everybody's been anticipating for weeks, so let's hope it happens.
Well, of course, the Kim family has long wanted legitimacy on
Yes.
the world stage.
Yes.
We've seen Chairman Kim, he has branched out from North Korea. He's met with the South Korean leader. He has entered China twice just in the past recent months. He's had this amazing welcome last night on his walkabout through Singapore. This is giving him a lot of legitimacy, and we haven't even come to an agreement with Trump.
Prime Minister Lee said this morning in a very cogent address, or talking about his meeting with Kim, he said he's a very self-assured young man, and no one's quite sure how old he is, probably about 35, but he's got an appearance, a presentation that belies his lack of real-world experience, and that's what's happening here. If I may quickly go back to something Brett said in Singapore, though, I think we have to be very careful about saying that how many people are actually starving in North Korea. Actually, the economy is beginning to do better. It's beginning to do better, and not all the money is being diverted into a nuclear program. And Kim is very much aware that he wants this to happen. The second thing I'll quickly say is that don't forget the two presidents, Kim and President Moon, have signed on the 27th of April the Panmunjom Declaration for Peace, Prosperity and Unification on the Korean Peninsula. Now, these two leaders of these two countries don't do that for no reason at all, and it's really not for the United States to dictate the terms of this. They themselves have their own interests, their own national interests, and it seems to me that there's a good deal of goodwill. And as far as the South Koreans are concerned, yes, up in Edgecliff there's a dear old Korean couple who run a dry cleaning store. I said to them the other day, isn't this exciting, what's happening? No, it is not. We do not want this to happen. Kim is a bad man. That's a minority view in South Korea. My sense is that 60% of the people are really quite exhilarated by this and hoping that it leads to this declaration being realised.
There's been a bit of talk about the economy in the last few months, particularly since Kim took over. Do you think that this is his priority now, that they have achieved their nuclear aim and now it's about the economy? And if that is the case, how will they hold on to things politically if the economy starts to take off?
Brian, if I could put myself into his brain, and I can't, I would say that that's exactly what Kim wants. He wants to have, now that he's got nuclear capability, and the question is, will he ever give it away? And I'm not sure that he will at all. That has to wait to see the dynamics play out with the United States. But what he wants to move on to now is economic development. Here he is in Singapore walking around wide-eyed at the prosperity of this small island country. And he's thinking, good gosh, we could have some of this too. And you know, the South Korea has done so well. North Korea is a long way behind and has been falling further behind, but in the 50s, 60s they were ahead. Now they're well behind, but they could catch up, and I think that's certainly on his mind.
Surely that, though, means that the Kim family has to start giving up some of its real authoritarian power. How do you have a market economy in a completely closed-off dictatorship?
Well, you've got capitalism in China. You've got capitalism in Vietnam. You've still got communism.
I would have thought there's a belief in the party in the way that there's not a belief in the individual.
Well, this is more a kingdom than it is a communist party. That's true, and you've got the third successor. But it does seem to me, I don't think this is all play acting and all rehearsals in Pyongyang when you see people waving and cheering, and there is a genuine feeling of support for Kim, I think, at this stage.
Here we go. Here's the picture. Touched his arm.
Look at this.
Somber looks.
So there is some chatter between the two men, but we're not quite sure what was said.
No interpreters, so they must be speaking English.
And what do you make of the body language? Are they smiles or grimaces?
Stoic determination.
Neither one wants to look weak in front of the other.
That's right.
And there they go. Now for just an hour by themselves and interpreters. Is that dangerous, Richard?
Who knows?
Well, Trump loves to make a deal, doesn't he?
He does, and as I said before, he's a businessman and he's a showman.
He's touching him yet again now. You can see that he's making an effort to...
and he's being touched in return.
Yeah,
they're shaking hands again.
Yeah, and a bit of a smile. Oh. Really amazing pictures when you think about it, isn't it? I mean, who could have predicted this just 6 months ago?
Brian, that's right. Who would have thought?
With the Twitter war that was happening, the name calling just a few months ago.
My button's bigger than yours, yeah.
The initial summit being called off, and yet here we are with these historic pictures now. Donald Trump shaking hands with Kim Jong-un.
But don't forget that name calling is not discriminate. Remember, what did he call the Prime Minister of Canada the other day, Donald Trump? I mean, really, the man sprays this stuff around as if it's confetti.
Yeah, so that was his advisors saying that there was a special place in hell for Justin Trudeau.
Right. Yeah. It was when they were comparing buttons, you know, whose is bigger and whose is active.
We're going to head back to Seoul now and just see what the reaction has been there. So let's check in now with our reporter Hannah Sinclair in Seoul. Hannah, can you hear me?
Yes, Janice. Look, that historic moment, we just heard cheers here, a loud applause from people in the station at Seoul, in Seoul. Big smiles on their faces. This is a huge moment for them. And so while not everyone would be thinking this summit is a good idea, many people do here. They welcome this. And their applause and their reaction to that is testament to that.
Richard, you were making the point that you felt that most South Koreans would be in support of some sort of peace treaty being offered, some sort of path to peace in any case. There was a recent poll, though, I should tell you, that where 78% of South Koreans said that Chairman Kim was trustworthy. Now, that's interesting, isn't it?
That is worthy. Look, can I just say that what, in my view, in my time in Seoul, what I found was that people were worried about the existential threat of another war. That's what they don't want, another war. They don't necessarily want a reunified Korea. Just like the Germans were worried about taking on East Germany and the poverty that they'd have to inherit and somehow ameliorate. I think the Koreans feel the same way. They don't want to inherit a basket case. And when you look at the Chinese don't want a reunified Korea at all. Neither do the Japanese. So it's really a matter of getting some kind of understanding, opening up Kaesong industrial zone again, allowing family reunions, allowing a trust to develop between the two leaders, including the hotline that they've now established between.
I think we can hear them talking to each other.
They never stop. I feel really great. We're going to have a great discussion, and I think tremendous success. They'll be tremendously successful. And it's my honor, and we will have a terrific relationship, I have no doubt.
우리는 아주 굉장히 성공할 걸로 믿습니다. 그리고 아주 만나게 돼서 굉장히 영광스럽게 생각합니다. 아주 훌륭한 관계를 가지고 있고 아주 전혀 의심 없이 좋은 관계를 우리가 맺을 거라고 생각합니다.
여기까지 오는 길이 그게 쉬운 길은 아니에요.
Well, it was not easy to get here.
우리한테는 우리 발목을 잡는 그 과거가 있고 또 그릇된 편견과 관행들이 우리 때로는 우리 눈과 귀를 가리우기도 했는데 우리 모든 것을 이겨내고 이 자리까지 왔습니다.
The past worked as fetters on our limbs, and the old prejudices and practices worked as obstacles on our way forward, but we overcame all of them, and we are here today.
That's true. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
This way. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
So we're hearing there from both men sounding pretty optimistic. Donald Trump talking about the prospect of tremendous success. He says there's a terrific relationship. And Kim Jong-un talking about overcoming obstacles and taking positive strides forward. Brett Mason, let's check in with you now in Singapore. How do you think the rest of this day will play out?
Well, Donald Trump has made clear that he really thinks these discussions will all hinge on personality, not so much politics. We saw there the two leaders symbolically walking from either side and meeting in the middle. We saw both nations' flags flying in the background. They paused there for a moment, both looking, it must be said, slightly anxious or nervous. There weren't any smiles, which is what we were told to expect from the White House. Then they walked side by side into this separate meeting room for what we call a media spray opportunity, where we heard a few words, as you just said there, Janice, from both leaders. Now they will break away from their delegations, their diplomats who have been here for the last 3 days trying to agree some type of framework, and they'll sit down and talk through their translators one-on-one. Now, Donald Trump makes a lot about his negotiating skills, the fact that he can read a room and will know within a split second whether any deal really is a good chance of being done here at this summit. But when you look back on Kim Jong-un's negotiating history, he is quite charismatic. He is painted as this really unknown dictator that no one really knows all that much about. But we saw recently with the summit with the South Koreans, people that were involved in those talks say that he was cracking jokes. He's quite charismatic, and he sort of wrong-footed the South Korean diplomats. They weren't quite expecting that. We heard another story about the IOC visiting Pyongyang and him cracking jokes about him clearly having the physique of an athlete, and that shocked those delegates who weren't expecting him to be making jokes. So he may in some ways wrong-foot Donald Trump, who thinks that he has the upper hand. When you look at the personalities and the dynamics of this, these are two men who are both incredibly unpredictable. And I was talking to some former State Department diplomats in the last few days, and they actually see that as a rare opportunity, believe it or not, for the United States. They say traditionally North Korea has had the upper hand because their leader has been unpredictable, and this State Department or former State Department official actually used the word crazy and said, but at this particular summit, the United States has a leader who is equally unpredictable and appears to be just as crazy or unstable in terms of how these diplomatic events generally play out. Both of these leaders also need to return home with some type of a victory, however symbolic. And the only way they can do that is by some form of consensus, and that's why most people here think that there'll be some form of symbolic agreement, that perhaps the United States will remove North Korea from the list of state sponsors of terrorism. That won't change much because those sanctions are still in place. The United States might agree to relax some of those sanctions in return for a irreversible and verifiable process of denuclearization, but again, that's going to take time, and a lot of people who have been at these summits, they've heard these platitudes all before, are concerned that perhaps Donald Trump might be so keen or so eager to return to Washington with some type of a victory that he may give away too much too soon. The United States, though, has been quick to stress to us here on the ground during a briefing in the last few hours that that's not going to happen. They insist that the president has spent a lot of time preparing for this summit, and he is not going to be played by the North Koreans. Right now, they are sitting alone in a room talking one-on-one. It would be remarkable to try and guess what they're saying, Brian and Janice.
That's for sure. Thanks so much, Brett, for that analysis. Of course, this all comes after decades of tension, hostilities, and of course, lives lost. But let's take a look at how we reached this point. The 1953 armistice signing brought an end to fighting in the Korean War, but it left the Korean peninsula on edge. Two nations still technically at war, separated by a 4-kilometre wide strip of no man's land, known as the Demilitarised Zone. To the south, a rapidly developing country that has embraced democracy as it finds its place in the world. To the north, a totalitarian regime, ruled by dynasty, ruled by fear, where dissent was crushed and dissenters sent to labour camps or executed. From Kim Il-sung to Kim Jong-il and Kim Jong-un, supreme leaders with ultimate power. North Korea became known as the Rogue Nation, the Hermit Kingdom, part of the Axis of Evil.
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world.
In 1976, it began its missile development program, its first Scud fired 8 years later. In 2016, North Korea declared it had a missile capable of striking the United States. And in July last year, it fired its first intercontinental missile. 2 months later, Donald Trump stood in the United Nations General Assembly and labelled Kim Jong-un Rocket Man, insisting Kim was on a suicide mission. President Trump vowed to totally destroy North Korea if provoked.
The United States has great strength and patience, but if it is forced to defend itself or its allies, we will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea.
But with the Winter Olympics came a thawing of relations. North Korea would compete in South Korea. Athletes marched under a united flag. There was even a joint Korean team in the women's ice hockey. Shortly after, the promise of a meeting between the leaders of the North and South and a change in rhetoric put a US-North Korea summit on the agenda. Kim Jong-un became the first North Korean leader to set foot in South Korea when he crossed the DMZ in April. He and Moon Jae-in promising to bring an official end to the war. The Trump-Kim meeting was abruptly cancelled last month after angry words were exchanged. But a visit to Washington by Kim's right-hand man helped heal the rift, setting the scene for today's historic Singapore summit. And it has indeed already begun. We've seen a couple of historic handshakes already and some positive words from both leaders. Brian, what's your take on this so far?
Determination to to have something to show from this. It was quite clear from their body language that particularly when you saw President Trump there touching the North Korean leader, that they want to make personalities is really important in summits, and they want to make sure that these two that they get on and that they have something to show for themselves at the end of the day. I think there will be a declaration signed. It won't be complete verifiable nuclear disarmament, but it will set out a pathway, and it will be something that Donald Trump can take and wave and say, look what I've achieved.
Will that be satisfactory to US allies, though? If we look at what's happened at the G7 summit, he's got no problem turning his back on some of the people that should be his good friends. So will a deal today with Kim Jong-un necessarily please some of his important US allies?
This will be a long process. There won't actually be a deal. Some of the things that people will be worried about, for example, the South Koreans, about American troops and what's going to happen to them, these are issues for much further down the line. This will be about a general statement of North Korea aiming to denuclearise and America offering certain things, particularly economic things, in return. But the contentious decisions, there won't be anything huge today that the allies need to worry about. Would you say so, Richard?
I would. I'd also say that I think all the allies, everyone has been looking at this with a great deal of expectation. I don't think anyone is going to be upset at this stage, and I'd like to risk my own judgment by saying this is going to lead somewhere. I think that what we've seen, the atmospherics, are really quite good. And when you look at, we're talking about the personality of these two leaders, when you saw Moon Jae-in standing beside Kim Jong-un at the 38th parallel at the border, you could see all that personality in Kim Jong-un. It's unscripted. It's just there. It's spontaneous.
Very candid.
Now, whether that can spark off with Donald Trump's braggadocio, his capacity to be a showman, this is going to be very important. That, as Brian says, is superficial, because what we're looking at here is the possible raising of the curtain on a stage where we're going to have deep and complex negotiations, both to disarm, as Pompeo has said, Secretary of State has said, it's got to be complete and irreversible and verifiable. But that won't be for nothing. On the other hand, you've got the things that the North Koreans want. May I just say too that the Japanese have been more anxious about what's happening in North Korea than the South Koreans have.
Yeah.
The South Koreans don't want an existential war because that'll just stuff up everything. The Japanese are worried about Donald Trump not giving away, not just agreeing to intercontinental ballistic missiles being taken off the table. They want medium and short-range missiles taken off too, because they're the things that threaten Japan. Japan, as I said, is terribly worried about getting involved in this act. China will be involved, certainly. We might even go back to the six-party talks, which would be a very good thing, in my view.
Let's head to Singapore now. That's where it's all happening. Brett Mason, what are you making of this at the moment? We've seen that historic handshake. And tell us what some of your expectations are now for the rest of the day.
Well, this is the theatrics of the summit. Both leaders polite but firm during that photo opportunity. Now really the hard work begins. The first initial meeting one-on-one will, according to the White House, build the relationships, the kind of candour for the more difficult discussions later this afternoon. We know what the United States wants ultimately. It wants greater transparency from North Korea. It also wants a complete, verifiable and irreversible process of denuclearization. In return, we know also what North Korea wants. It wants its sovereignty and security assured, and it wants greater international investment. How those two needs and wants meet somewhere in the middle, we will know in a few hours' time. But yes, it's right to say, it's fair to say that there is a lot of optimism, perhaps more optimism than we've seen during the two previous rounds of these negotiations. We know, though, too, that both leaders will be departing from Singapore this evening, Australian time. Kim Jong-un will depart first, back on board that Air China 747 that is usually used to ferry around Chinese government officials. He'll fly out in around 5 hours' time. Then US President Donald Trump will speak with journalists around 6 p.m. Australian time. That is when we expect, Janice, to find out exactly what has been agreed during this historic summit. On any standard, it is historic. Some people disagree with the tactics and the rhetoric going into these discussions, but this is something that the United States and North Korea have waited many decades for. The first meeting between the leaders of these two respective countries that have for so many years been sworn enemies. Janice?
Thank you so much. That's Brett Mason updating us live from Singapore. It's all happening, that meeting between Kim Jong-un and, of course, Donald Trump. We also thank our reporter Hannah Sinclair, who was reporting live from Seoul. And, of course, we'll hear comprehensive coverage from both of you in tonight's SBS World News Bulletin at 6:30. And, gentlemen, Brian Thompson, Richard Brunowski, thanks so much for your analysis. It's been an exciting morning so far.
History in the making, Janice.
That's right. Let's see.
Unprecedented.
That's it. Well, I'm glad that you were joining us today with your analysis. Much appreciated. But that is where we leave our special coverage for now. Should the leaders come out with any news, we will, of course, return live to Singapore. Thank you again to our guests, former Australian Ambassador to South Korea, Richard Brunowski. And we'll have further coverage and analysis online right throughout the day and, of course, in SBS World News tonight on 6:30. We return our viewers now to regular World Watch programming.